We're on, we're rolling.
Okay. Yeah, hello. Here is the Ideal Spaces Foundation and Alan Siegel. We will make a podcast with Dieter Plehwe from the Wissenschaftszentrum für Sozialforschung in Berlin about the neoliberal agenda.
And I'm Alan Siegel. I'm here in Budapest and joining Ulrich and Dieter for this podcast. And we welcome you, Dieter, and really appreciate your participation in this conversation and in the symposium.
Thanks, and thanks, Ulrich. Myself, I'm Dieter Plehwe, working here at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin für Sozialforschung, Berlin Social Science Center, for the better of the last 25 years. And among the research subjects I have covered is the topic of the history and politics of neoliberalism, of organized neoliberalism. This has basically led to a number of different research venues, both in the history and in comparative study of neoliberal networks of intellectuals, think tanks, and ideas and practices.
That's great.
Yeah.
And you are the co-editor of a book about the origins of the Mount Pelerin Society. And maybe you could just give us an introduction to what the Mount Pelerin Society is or was.
Sure. This was basically the research I had originally developed jointly with Bernhard Walpen, a Swiss social scientist. Both he and I, in the course of our PhD research activities, had come across an organized group of academic intellectuals and a few business people, journalists, and a few politicians. And originally we had just collected basically bits and pieces of newspaper information, which always published about the conferences of the Mount Pelerin Society, newspapers like the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, the Wall Street Journal, a few others, but it was basically unknown what this group was. When we started to look into this, it turned out it was basically the group that Friedrich August von Hayek, Wilhelm Röpke, the Swiss businessman Hunold, had founded in 1947, merging basically plans of both Röpke in Geneva and Hayek in London, to set up a group of convinced liberals, basically people who were adamant in the need and understanding the need to renovate liberalism since the 1930s. So when this meeting resulted in basically the founding meeting of the Mount Pelerin Society in 1947 on the Mont Pelerin in the Hotel du Parc, that's above the Lake of Geneva, the Lake of Geneva. So this was the founding meeting, 38 people, more than half of them from Europe, the others from the United States, including a few people from the Chicago School, like Stiegler. And here it was, where the group basically set up a discussion on a wide range of topics. So by no means just economics, really. So like everything from philosophical, political perspective, interesting to discuss and understand the crisis of the time and to develop essentially an agenda. Maybe we should go back here for a second, because the 15 of the 38 had already convened in Paris in 1938 in the colloque Walter Lippmann to discuss Walter Lippmann's book, The Good Society, which was basically at the time so like a very hot book for European and American liberals living in this, what they perceived as a huge crisis, not only of the advance of Soviet socialism, Bolshevism, and German Nazi fascism and Italy's Mussolini fascism, but also the reforms of the New Deal in the United States. And so Lippmann had basically adopted a lot of the analysis of Ludwig von Mises and British August von Hayek to distinguish between a liberal and a totalitarian order. And with totalitarian, he didn't refer to like Hannah Arendt, to the sort of like absence of political and other freedoms, but basically just the absence of economic freedom. So here we have for the first time an essential element of the neoliberal agenda, that economic freedom is considered the basis on which everything else is built. So in turn, this also means that you can compromise on all kinds of other dimensions of freedom, social, democratic, and so on, if you just secure the economic part of it. The other way around, according to neoliberal ideas, doesn't work. And so in Paris, basically, this meeting, which was at the time under the umbrella of the League of Nations, so it was one conference in a series of conferences. But even there, the group that led the conference, Roger from France and Röpke and from Geneva and a few others, basically decided that they would set up a few think tanks, or one think tank with different locations in New York, in London, in Geneva, to continue in an organized manner the work on a program that was for the first time labeled in the conference protocols of the colloque Walter Lippmann, neoliberalism. And basically already in 1938, so we should understand, we have the precise birthplace and birthday of what we today still continue to discuss as a neoliberal project.
But this is very interesting historical background. I think important to understand what a neoliberal agenda is today. No? Regarding the latter, the neoliberal agenda, in your point of view, what are the major elements making up this agenda? No? Based on the premise you already mentioned, as the economy is the base of freedom, to make it short. No? And which are the major elements making up this agenda, together with its premises, with its basic assumptions underlying these elements?
Economy as the basis of freedom would be a little bit too broad, because economy can obviously be different things. So what they believed in was an economy based thoroughly and steadfastly on private property. So we have to actually, again, go back for a second, since neoliberalism comes in varieties, including the Austrian Economic School, the German Ordoliberal ventures, the Chicago School people, what Quinn Slobodian is called, the Geneva School, and many other locations where circles of neoliberals developed, contributed to development. It's one mistake that we think of neoliberalism usually by the name of Milton Friedman or Friedrich August von Hayek, where we have to actually study a group of by now 1,200 people in just one organized network of the Montparnasse Society. And that's certainly just sort of like a good approach to start with those and not to end with those. And but as I said, in the beginning, there were just this relatively small group. And so it makes it a bit more easy to look at neoliberal history in the early days than in the present day, of course. But if you think of the time again, why did neoliberalism really emerge as a program in the 1930s? And this is very important to understand the agenda, the broader perspective. In the 1920s, of course, you had already many people, many liberal economists who started to reflect on the limits of liberalism. You had the German school in the face of the late 20s, Rostow, Röpke, everybody calling for liberal interventionism, which was unheard of with regard to labor markets or with regard to other product markets, because the traditional laissez-faire ideology was the economy is best left by itself, self-regulating markets, and so on and so forth. And that was what Carl Polanyi described basically as the counter perspective to his own perspective. And he used the name of the leading neoliberals, Mises and others, to basically discuss what he blamed for the misery. And until then, basically, many of the liberal economists nevertheless used, the term was first used in the mid-20s in the modern neoliberal, right-wing liberal sense as a renovation of traditional liberalism. It was still used mostly in the perspective against Soviet collectivism, against socialism, and not yet as a critique of the traditional liberal perspective, which had basically naturalized the system of capitalism. And only after the Great Depression and the basic total failure of liberal economics to deal with the depression, to basically cope with the problem of half the workforce in the United States being unemployed. We know the history of Germany, and only then, basically, more and more, it kind of there was a process of realization that traditional laissez-faire economics does not suffice. There is no such thing as a self-regulating market. There's no such thing as self-regulated capitalism. It will break down. And so this was the moment when many neoliberals agreed that they had to be in the competition on how to reform institutions of society, of economy, social relations in general, in order to compete with the competing proposals. Imagine, on the one hand, collectivism. They basically lumped together Nazi Germany and Bolshevik Russia. So collectivism, everything that was not sort of like giving primacy to private property and markets, but organizing, using the state basically to organize a future perspective. But also the incipient social liberalism, the forces that were basically very important in the New Deal, or in the UK in the early welfare programs. So basically the other neoliberalism, the social liberalism that endeavored to support society by the welfare state, so that people were no longer subject to the risk of the capitalist market relations. And there was also from this side, of course, the support for trade unions, countervailing forces in society against the overbearing power of capitalist enterprise and their associations. In the 1930s, more munition was shot in civil incidences, employers against trade unions in the United States than by the army. So you had a hugely violent picture, not only in Nazi Germany and Mussolini fascism, but also in the United States. And here was the moment where basically it was clear, and that was 1938 then brought to the point, we need to have a new perspective for a not totalitarian order in the sense of economic freedom order that is basically able to keep at a distance the collectivist approaches, be they fascist, be they socialist, or be they social democrat. When Hayek wrote Road to Serfdom, he dedicated the book to the socialists in all parties. So basically the opposition he faced was the socialist, because no matter how weakly a step was taken to support the welfare state, for him it was a slippery slope leading down right away into a planned disaster. And so here you see the complicated task. On the one hand, staunchly anti-socialist, anti-communist. On the other hand, sort of like feeling a lot of pressure to meet the challenge of the social liberals, of the welfare state liberals. And so they had to come up not only with the critique of all this, but they had to also come up with solutions beyond, oh, let the market do it. So what we know about neoliberalism, when neoliberalism is equated to a market radicalism, it's completely false. It could not be more wrong to understand neoliberalism as this kind of market radical perspective. Basically, when it was founded, it was very clear that the need is to secure the market order based on private property, based on freedom of contract, and so on and so forth. There need to be institutional orders and other securitizations of the order, both at the domestic level in the national economy, and this was the complementary dimension of the global economy. Hence, Geneva School, the planning for the post-war global order, to basically stabilize and secure and defend the system based on private property and freedom of contract against all these other challenges. And this was not an easy task. It required a lot of work because imagine this tiny group of 38 people. Okay, they had quite a bit of backing from rich people, from the Swiss credit, Schweizer Kreditanstalt, where Hunold basically secured the means for the first meeting, and from the Volcker Fund from the United States, where basically the money flowed for the participation of the American participants in the meeting. But from there, they basically developed this project to expand circles of committed participants in this debate, and to explore what should alternatives look like. How can we conceive of, for example, in the statement of aims of the Montparnasse Society, people who think that neoliberalism did sort of completely reject welfare state measures will be surprised to read that they support social minimum standards, not inimical to the market and to initiative. So basically, it's clear then that, you know, if the one perspective is to create a social welfare state that gives transfer monies to people basically in need, the answer of the neoliberal is not necessarily, oh, don't do that. Maybe it's necessary because the person cannot support herself or himself due to all kinds of circumstances, but do it in a way that the person doesn't need it for long. So essentially what we recently, and since the New Labour, Blair, Clinton, German, Schröder administrations, we kind of see this perfectly turned into practice by combining the kind of elements of welfare and conditionality, workfare, and threaten even sort of like if people don't do more to help themselves, in quotation mark, then they actually even lose the benefits, which would be a return basically to the very traditional 19th century or Victorian age type of, well, let them be.
So what you just described seems to me that requires a certain amount of state intervention in order to make the neoliberal agenda work.
Absolutely. This is one of the most hilarious jokes about the public understanding or widespread misunderstanding of neoliberalism, that it is anti-state. No, it's exactly the opposite. It's basically very clear that you need to conquer the state, very much like any other sort of like ideology that try to claims power in society, that the centrality of the state was absolutely recognized and embraced by this cohort of neoliberals. You, of course, have variations of ideologies inspired by libertarian thinking, anarcho-capitalists, who basically claim that they want to do away with the state. But Buchanan, as president of the Montparnasse Society, at some point took on exactly this perspective and suggested, well, this is not possible. We within the Montparnasse Society believe that, of course, the state we are always enslaved to the state. So, of course, the state is not the friend, we're always enslaved. But it makes a huge difference if we are enslaved to 90% or to 10%. So, but there was no doubt that to secure the free market orders, exactly the capitalist order, you need the state, its police force, its military force as the last element. But then it's not enough. It's a very Gramscian understanding of the stability of order that does not rely only on the formal institutions of the state, but the neoliberals were basically in the game together with Gramsci to invent the civil society as the second element of stabilization of society, and hence basically their investment in all kinds of civil society institutions and their extreme attention to sort of like questions of what happens in civil society and what needs to be done in civil society. Mm-hmm. And we should not underestimate this dimension.
Yeah, this point brings me back to my initial question. to outline the major elements of this neoliberal concepts. What are the elements and how they relate to each other according to concepts?
Well, yeah, thanks to Michel Foucault and his biopolitics lectures from 1978, which were translated in English only much later, and only in the United States there's a huge readership of Foucault initially, which then essentially brought back the discussion of ordoliberalism, in particular in the global debate. And because Foucault basically rightfully suggested that ordoliberalism is very central for the neoliberal ideas because of the recognition of the element of order, that the state needs to be utilized to secure competition and secure the competitive order and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, unfortunately, many readers of Foucault's lectures of 1978 focus very much on his other focus in the works, namely Gary Becker and what we call economic imperialism, which has been embraced by neoliberals and proudly, sort of like we apply our economic methods of analysis to any area in society. And so basically the Homo economicus picture of everybody is individual and tries to follow his personal interests and maximize his interests, and therefore it's sort of like the market works in every sphere of society, and that has brought us a notion of the central goal of neoliberalism allegedly was the market, which could also again not be more wrong, since the market essentially is always only essential as an alternative to the state, but not as the principal means of organizing. It was sort of like using Gary Becker's method of analysis and universalizing it as a concept, which however, is not a universal concept in neoliberalism. If you look at the historical deliberations, it all starts with property rights. So essentially, and this is of course a very old liberal discourse against the feudal lord's ability and opportunity to destroy any property of his underlings. The human rights discourse, of course, developed property rights as an essential element for humans, which, however, was of course always a little bit restrained and didn't mean that any individual could have as much property as he or she wanted, and so on and so forth. With the neoliberal sort of like reaffirmation of property rights and defending of not only property rights in general, but also the extremely uneven distribution of property, it becomes a complete new legitimization for basically what we know as the present day's absolutely uneven distribution of property. Because, of course, one element of property rights is also that you should not be taxed to an extent that your property is taken away. Linked to property rights means people who own capital is the freedom of contract as the second essential concept. So you're not only entitled to what you have, no matter how much it is, but you're also entitled to do with it what you want. No restraints. The rich person is supposed to do with his property or her property whatever she wants. And who is sort of possibly against it? Well, on the one hand, the working classes who want to take away some of the property to redistribute, or the state who wants to take away some of it to do whatever. Social democratic states, maybe welfare states, authoritarian states, maybe military, whatever. And again, this is not necessarily convincing from the perspective of the neoliberals, unless it is necessary to protect sort of like the property order. So the third element, to shield the people who have property and want to do with it what they want from the institutions of the state, is the rule of the law. This is the third and critical element, because the rule of the law is not just what we think of in pluralist theory as an independent judiciary and the separation of powers, but it's exactly an arrangement of if there is a parliamentarian democracy, an arrangement of the governance, the governing processes in a way that majoritarian groups, that politicians that are elected and have a majority in parliament cannot easily and simply make law. So that like cannot use them, their majorities to impose interventions on society. So basically the ideal way of governance, if it is a democracy, is that in parliaments and in governments, the room of maneuver for government and for parliament should be severely restricted and limited to sort of like absolutely essential and necessary elements, and should not be extended to many areas where basically the propertied class wants basically to keep the autonomy and to keep the right to do what they want. And this is a very important element, because here we see the sort of like very backward vision of neoliberals that are very happy with the ideas of the good capitalist who owns a family business, takes care of his employees, invests a little bit in the school, in the village, and so on and so forth, and is not sort of like restricted by a political force that imposes on her or on him how this should be done. So basically have control, patriarchal control of the property owner, both in his own corporation. One could add the family, because it's truly quite a patriarchal order, and also in the community, so that basically the heile Welt, the well-functioning ideas that Wilhelm Röpke also had in mind when he talks about his Swift ideal, is sort of like a rather sort of like small-scale version of a free market order, where the bourgeois is basically in control essentially of most areas of things, and the political sort of like officials have a bit of a limited role to play. And of course, this was not exactly compatible with the developments of industrial capitalism of the 20s, 30s, and then of course the post-war explosion of a global capitalist order with all its imperatives. And nevertheless, it gave kind of a clear idea in which ways, in which directions you want to move society, and in which directions you want society not to move. And this kind of compass about these, based on these three critical elements, property rights, freedom of contract, rule of law, is a quintessential dimension of the neoliberal program that then, of course, needs to be applied to all kinds of controversies. I mean, we see from the 1950s in their regular meetings, the discussions going on to cover about everything that happens around the world, which is of interest for the future development of society. That this literature, basically the literature that this organized group of neoliberals produced together also with other friends, is essentially what we need to read to understand what neoliberals think, what they want. Not necessarily always everybody is on the same page. There's controversy within the groups. If you have 1,200 people worldwide so far, at each point in time, about 500 in this group of the Montparnasse Society, many of them also collaborating with think tanks that have quite a bit of money to employ other people and to invest in all kinds of projects. This gives you a lot of material where you can ascertain what organized neoliberal people think, what they want, in which ways they want to go. And this is a much richer base for the discussion of neoliberalism than the speculation we see frequently, not really based in much sort of like source material, usually using like one figurehead and assuming that this person represents neoliberalism, which is again very problematic, because it's way too large a group to pin it down to a sort of like individual. Some, of course, are more relevant than others, for sure. But this is also only possible to see almost exposed, because Hayek's ideas about a new constitution, he wanted to go back to the old kind of bicameral system where most of the decisions would be taken by a property group of people, and the minor decisions would be taken by the elected parliamentarians. Didn't fly. We can discuss if his idea about privatization of money to avoid the power of the central bank I mean, it didn't exactly fly, but of course it's more relevant with modern cryptocurrency developments than it's Hayek probably himself would have dreamed.
Yes, I want to come back later on these recent tendencies regarding neoliberalism, but very short. First, let's go back to the program itself and the elements, its core elements you outlined. This is the basic understanding, okay. And as far as I understood it, it relates to a certain Menschenbild, a certain image of the human. According to this program, could you summarize? It's an abstract concept, of course, but it is an image of the human. A certain conditio humana has to be installed, if I understood properly, in the end, to ensure a well-functioning society, based on these three premises. What is the image of the human related to these three premises you outlined?
Well, maybe it's not possible to deduce just from these elements the ideas about the human. Maybe it's firstly important to recognize that within what we call thought collectives, because that's a crowd of people that thinks sort of like along certain dimensions in a very similar directions, even if not necessarily exactly along the same lines in every question. But we see, for example, that within the realm of organized neoliberals, we have, for example, people who are very inspired by Ayn Rand, the American libertarian sort of like hero, who is very much expressing this kind of selfishness, this positive selfishness idea. So realize yourself, and then your world is good. Don't give so much to the others. Don't expect others to give to you. Kind of a very negative idea about the selfish.
The point I'm after also the implicit assumptions.
Yes, and this is inspiring apparently very much for much of the libertarian youth movement, where sort of like the idea that you have to break against all kinds of resistances to realize yourself. It's very much also in line with the sort of like history of the liberal dimension, the progressive liberal dimension of freeing the individual from the old bonds, what we call in sociology Individualisierung, individualization. Get rid of traditional roles, and so you have this element of where you can also see how sort of like left people can also feel comfortable in this kind of taking it in a kind of an anarchistic direction against, or protest against everything. And this is very important because it's a source of inspiration basically for what we can easily call the youth movement of neoliberals, the libertarian Students for Liberty, all kinds of organizations. And it's very important also here to note very clearly that what they embrace there is not an order of markets to which everybody is subjected. It's made explicit in the description of the self-understanding that this would also mean that the market undermines yourself.
So that is an important point in the recent discussion. This is it's one of the major perspectives, as I perceived it at least. Neoliberal agenda equals an unlimited means brute market, as a Thomas Hobbes in the new version, homo homini lupus, and that's it. And therefore, a clarification is important, and to
super
outline
important, because the promise for the neoliberal liberation is that the individual is basically higher than the market and should strive to be higher than the market. Peter Thiel's ideas about competition is for losers. You want to become the monopolist, and so on and so forth. It's very interesting how how this is clarification for people who, yeah, it's not very promising if you have to be a slave to anything, no? So you have to also make sure that you're not just a slave to the market, no? And how can you avoid becoming a slave to the market? You have to be basically dominating the market, no? But anyways, this is one version of of understanding sort of like the human nature and dimension build, the conditio humana. But for example, universalizing this would completely ignore writings of Hayek and others who rejected the Homo economicus model, and possibly
what they proposed instead. So if you speak about
basically here we come to basically we need to observe the ways in which neoliberalism is rooted in Scottish Enlightenment, which is basically the conservative Enlightenment tradition, unlike the French Enlightenment, or frequently opposed to the French Enlightenment perspective, with Rousseau and the kind of ideas derived from, which basically lead into this ideas of republican society and planning mechanisms and so on and so forth. And Scottish Enlightenment was, of course, much more conservative in its basically understanding of social relations. And we can see the traces of this thinking both in the way in which, yes, it's liberalism and therefore a secularization of the understanding of the world, a big role for reason, but the conservative Enlightenment is also limiting the role of reason and embraces a secularized understanding of religion. And so we have on the one hand a controversy between traditional religion and the rejection of the secularization of understanding of religion. So that's why we get a big controversy in post-war Germany, where the strongest attack on neoliberals, on the ordo-liberal school, Eucken and Röpke and everybody, came actually from right-wing Catholics. And they wrote books on neoliberalism and how it's evil and how it destroys the society. And so there was for the neoliberal movement, one important coalition partner, namely the conservative religious forces, were actually a bit a dangerous element. And there were many secret meetings to try to mend the conflict and to suggest, no, we are not these neoliberals like Mises and everybody who want to leave everything to whatever. We want, a society rooted in cultural and religious social relations and so on and so forth. So very interesting how from very early on for Hayek, also in meetings at the Montparnasse Society, this potential division between the religious groups and the neoliberal groups was considered a grave danger. And there were many efforts undertaken to basically mend some of these difficult ambiguities and deal with them. And so Christianity and the discussion of religion was very strong in the meetings. And we see also that, Wilhelm Röpke himself, he was a Protestant, but he was an advisor to the Vatican and embraced many elements of Catholic social doctrine. We have a whole basically own perspective in the realm of organized neoliberalism, of Catholic neoliberalism, which is situated in Lord Acton Institutes, named after a Catholic liberal intellectual. And we see many efforts to basically clarify that, no, it's not pure individualism that we have in mind. And for example, if you think of the famous statement of Maggie Thatcher, who is always quoted as suggesting there's no such thing as society, This was the super statement, the strongest statement against the old visions of the trade unions and of social democracy, that we organize society. We have solidarity in society of the working class and so on and so forth. Maggie Thatcher says there's no such thing as society. I only know individuals. And then people usually stop reading because she says individuals and their families and communities. And so basically she expresses as the counter concept against the concept of social solidarity in society, she expresses the counter concept, her own concept And this is exactly the neoliberal communitarian concept of organizing solidarity in smaller units, namely family and community. And this is a very important element because it's very overlapping, of course, with the traditional Catholic social teaching. Basically, social solidarity at the local level also is embraced. Trade unions at the local level, self-help, worker self-help, mutual help is absolutely embraced. Götz Briefs writes very much about this and is a key architect of neoliberal social teaching and neoliberalism. And we see also this now as exactly an element of the counter program against the organization of solidarity in the framework of the welfare state on the societal level. No, devolve it, give it back to the community, bring it down to basically the level where people are supposed to also to be superior in organizing these elements by themselves.
This is a very important point. Yeah, please, Ellen, please.
Yeah, no, this is a very important point because the last part of it, what you were talking about, Dieter, and the connection to Ayn Rand. Okay, one of Ayn Rand's heroes is Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect. Okay, which was the subject of one of her books, and this kind of typifies what you just talked about in terms of like kind of this elitist coterie of people who like basically define the ideological cultural landscape of society.
Yeah, I mean, basically, this is the other element that many people underestimate, thinking of neoliberalism mostly in terms of an economic doctrine. And then don't, if you think this, you cannot explain why in the framework of the modern society and many other elements of organized neoliberal networks, you have a very strong collaboration, not only of economists and legal scholars, which is tradition, so like a very important element of the Staatswissenschaft, the science of the state, but also of all kinds of other academic disciplines, mostly social science, and humanities. History, of course, was very important to write counter narratives against the dominant narrative of the evolution of capitalism as an exploitative system. No, neoliberals started to embark on the project to explain that that capitalism is good for workers and so on and so forth. So you have many different elements where people were in the room to discuss across disciplines. So we have, based on the same basic ideas and values, you have a transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary, and then not only restricted to academic efforts, but also reaching out to think tanks and to media. So it becomes also not just transdisciplinary, but also trans-professional effort to build up these kind of understandings that were considered truly important to redirect the course of reforms of and engage in what we have seen as the typical on the one hand rollback reforms that were done to achieve more state-led development and then roll out alternatively programs that are easily considered conservative reforms or even reactionary reforms.
Let me go back. So far, so good. I deliberately want to come back to the issue of community and also for our less erudited readers, and therefore I'm in this almost journalist way. I try to come to the point. If we have different concepts of community coming out of the neoliberal philosophy, let's say, and taking into account the different streams inside this philosophy, there is no monolithic block of neoliberalism, but trying to make some statements. Okay, if there's no monolithic blocks, there are at least some major streams. What is the position of neoliberalism in the direction of community, how it conceives, and this is also related to the Menschenbild, the Conditio Humana, how an assumed good community should prosper under the aegis of these three principles of neoliberalism you outlined, plus what a good community is, and this directly relates again to the Menschenbild. If you can make a kind of summary, so in a journalistic way, so let's boil it down in the different aspects, and even if some different aspects are not compatible with each other.
It's, of course, always the question that you cannot ask academics.
No.
Academics will always say it's more complicated. Sorry.
It's more complex. Life is
It's,
complex.
I mean, I think the most important
Let's try.
the most important is firstly to recognize that neoliberals do not have an understanding of the human nature as a lonely wolf. No, they have absolutely embrace community. The more cosmopolitan-minded neoliberals also have no issue with communities that are open and diverse, whereas what people overlooked is that there is a large group of neoliberals in history and in the present that are actually very reluctant to embrace open communities and so permanently open communities, so like shifting short visits and so on and so forth. Fine. Well, there's think of Hayek's support for economic development as a social evolution process, always directed against ideas that you can plan the future. So the idea
These are the essential assumptions. Genau.
And then if you understand that the idea of social evolution is not just leaving things as they are. He has this famous article, Why I'm Not a Conservative. So things cannot remain frozen in the past. That's the issue neoliberals take with the conservatives. And basically the one progressive element that I always see in Röpke maintained from liberalism is also an understanding of meritocratic social mobility, which was also something the conservatives did not embrace. Historically, modern conservatism, of course, does. But so there is a certain dynamic in the neoliberal idea, but it's not a dynamic of rapid and radical change. It's a dynamic of evolutionary processes and in a way also a lot of continuity. So I think also of Popper's support for small reforms rather than large reforms, test and trial and be able to go back and so on and so forth if it doesn't work and so on and so forth. So it's all an understanding of a slow process of societal development transformations that you never know where it leads, as opposed to the idea that you can direct it knowing where it should lead. No, you don't, from the neoliberal perspective. So it's also, I mean, Hayek absolutely embraced the idea that neoliberals needed a utopia, which was one of the strengths of the other side, according to his own reading and his very important writing on intellectuals and socialism. He had a clear statement that the neoliberals also needed their utopia, but it's exactly the opposite of utopia. It's basically keeping the social evolutionary processes from his perspective open to lead somewhere where they would lead, not where somewhere would plan to lead them. So in order to at the same time secure stability in this sort of like small changing order, driven by, of course, the people, the property people, and so on and so forth, he embraced ideas of homogeneity, social, so like cultural homogeneity. So he was absolutely not in favor of sort of like a multicultural perspective. I mean, okay, he was living in the...
What is the ideal society? As if you have these different streams, this is very important and very interesting as regards the general perspective. And a general perspective is not always oversimplifying. A general perspective like this utopia you mentioned. I have read Hayek also. This is you need some kind of guiding star, some kind of utopia, even if you deny the possibility of a directed evolution. there is an implicit assumption about the ideal community, the best
It's
best
definitely
society.
always basically keep social evolution sort of in a way a little bit under control, decentralize. It's a very strong endorsement for decentralization. Also, not everybody goes as far as the Mises people who want basically as many states as possible, as small as possible, so they can do less damage. And I mean, in the Mises modern Mises perspective, is an extreme mixture of cultural conservatism and openness for diversity, because they basically say, okay, if somebody doesn't like it how it is here, you can move to the next state. No, so you can have an idea of all kinds
What's the general line? What's the general line? No? One general line is towards an assumed, an image, an eidos of an ideal community. What is the general line towards an ideal community? And so how
you tell me. I mean, you seem to know it.
No, please. No. Look, I have no ideas about it. I just want to come to the point, you know.
I think we had already many points, huh?
I want to go back to
Okay.
Margaret Thatcher, okay? Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, okay, who typified in popular consciousness the neoliberal agenda, okay? The two Anglo buddies, you know, who typified this is how we're going to make society work, and this is like trickle down economics. This is the answer. You know, if the rich do really well, it'll just like float down and everyone will be happy, okay? And along with this idea is like the counter narrative, which you mentioned, is the counter narrative is that the individual entrepreneur is the one who will save society. He's the this is the tool that will create innovation and so forth and bring us into the future, okay? But this is a big lie, no? I mean,
basically essentially, of course, this the replacement of collective sort of like efforts to promote welfare by the sort of like emphasis on individual contributions to this end, and to basically take the regulatory weight off the innovative people to basically accomplish this task. Of course, this is exactly the counter narrative or the complementary narrative to the deregulation of social welfare. And of course, it was I mean, you know, modern society, the large scale accumulation of capital, huge corporations, multinational corporations, workers at some point organized in strong unions, but then from the 1970s onwards, we see the complete decline of unionization in the United States in the most dramatic fashion. And so the loss of this countervailing power has, of course, enabled exactly these kind of neoliberal, right-wing liberal ideologies and given more space to ideas of, you know, the superhero, of the entrepreneur will do things. But we see the results. I mean, we see that we have a huge problem to tackle climate change, global warming, to achieve the necessary social ecological transformations, and so on and so forth. And this is exactly where neoliberalism comes also to a breaking point, because you cannot, I mean, we are talking, of course, since many years now about the crisis of neoliberalism. Many people have claimed neoliberalism at the end, and that was never true, because they underestimated the capacity of organized neoliberalism to also cope with the crisis and to find answers, find neoliberal answers to these questions. The question is, this is a discussion I would always confront neoliberals with. How do you come to terms with your key principle of property rights, unrestricted property rights, which also, of course, means unrestricted rights to on fossil fuels, oil, And we all know that if the existing property rights and of fossil fuels, if this is valorized, if you earn money by selling oil, then global warming cannot be tamed, cannot be kept under 1.5 or possibly 2 degrees, and that will destroy enormous amounts of property, which I find is the most critical kind of contradiction for neoliberals, because if you endorse fossil property rights, you actually allow the annihilation of many non-fossil property rights. So actually you are forced in this sphere to make important decisions of distribution, redistribution. And if you don't find an answer to this, you're not in the game anymore, because this simply happens. And of course, is very likely to. I mean, we see in the discussion now nicely about the question of the high water, the flooding events, and where people now discuss, oh, if we cannot have the state renaturalize the kind of natural environment to keep the problems of flooding at bay, then we need to have insurance as an alternative. Very neoliberal idea. You know, you cannot solve the problem by the state, but you have an alternative solution, individual insurance. But if you one proposal to say everybody has to pay in the insurance against flooding means, of course, nothing but a tax, an alternative tax. So
the people are flooded anyway.
And the German,
independent if they are insured, and then I'm dead by insurance. You know, wow.
The most neoliberal German party is now endorsing insurance, but only on an individual basis. So
yeah.
But you see exactly the difficulties neoliberals have to have in coping with exactly such questions, and where we can actually, it's not hard to observe certain limits.
This is an interesting point as to why I was after this community issue in my come down, boil it to the point, these very basic assumptions resulting out of the principles themselves, about the axiomatic, the 3 rules and so on. Okay. And on the other hand, the resulting concepts of community, the ideal community resulting out of the principles on the one hand, and on the other hand, what really happens. And this is one domain. And the other domain is a neoliberal market is no free market. It's a thesis. It's an assumption. We do not live in free markets. And this also is the predominant perception of what is a neoliberal agenda today. It is socially destructive, to make it short. It is ecologically destructive. The basic assumption that a good-minded and benevolent patriarchal entrepreneur will take care of his local community it holds not valid. Okay. This is the prevailing conception, and then what to do with it in order not to go in an easy bias. So when speaking about neoliberalism, this would be the bias. We speak about evil people. We speak about, it's not so easy. It's not so easy, and therefore I wanted to come back to the community question, also the implicit assumptions based on the explicit principles. Okay. What is?
Wait.
Please. I'm waiting.
It seems like, I mean, we haven't really touched on this a lot, but it seems to me it's really important in terms of the neoliberal agenda that there is a network of institutions and organizations that basically can disseminate the supremacy of this outlook in terms of economics and in terms of society. Okay, so what started out as like a small group of people today is actually much larger.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is basically one of the fascinating things about the history of neoliberalism. It was, of course, not an ideology. Normally, we associate with Weltanschauung, worldviews, ideologies, major political parties now, conservatism, social democracy, socialism, communism, fascism. this all took the shape of political parties, and neoliberalism did not take the shape of the political party. In fact, there were in the early history efforts to convince Hayek to join the Liberal International that was rebuilt after World War II. And Hayek was very reluctant and absolutely rejected the idea because he understood at the time that basically in the framework of political parties, the pressure of the parliamentarian system, there would be very much social compromise going on. And to keep the perspective, the alternative perspective to social democracy, social liberalism pristine, he wanted to keep a distance to all these different groups and also aim to influence not just one sort of like political grouping, but basically all of them. So when he dedicated Road to Serfdom to the socialists in all parties, he meant it. Sort of like, modern conservatism, modern liberalism, to his mind, became or were in the danger of becoming all very social democratic. And so basically we see, and in fact, absolutely true. The embracement of many more notions of equality, of opportunity, of gender equality, and so on by modern conservatism, and nearly everybody shows how conservatives basically adjusted in response to other challenges, adjusted ideology. So we see also in the other ideologies that you cannot stay orthodox. If you stay orthodox, you die. You have to basically be able to be flexible enough, open enough to integrate elements of the opposition to basically bring yourself to up to speed, up to date. And that's exactly the same with neoliberalism. If you stay orthodox, you die. And so the dynamics of neoliberalism also needed to change and to adjust to basically challenges. And we have seen that there were always moments when sort of like traditional elements were left behind and new things developed. And basically, in order to accomplish such a goal, neoliberals had a wonderful strategy. Unlike the left that talked about internationalism but became more and more parochial, the neoliberals organized from day one basically on a very international basis. Okay, originally transatlantic, but by ambition, really global. And we see in our society, the historical evolution, we see more and more the integration of people from other countries, even at the leadership position. The first Guatemalan president came in, the first Japanese president came in, and so on and so forth. We see in the discussion on culture that the topics of compatibility with neoliberal ideas and religious ideas were taken to the different religions, Confucianism, and so on and so forth. And so there was truly universal ambition. And the capacity to organize bi-yearly and then originally yearly, then bi-yearly conference, intermittently regional conferences, set them up in a way that they could organize a lot of comparative research and report on all kinds of elements. If you read the conference proceedings on the fate of the entrepreneur in the different countries, is a wonderful example of how you get an Indian perspective on a French perspective, a German, an American, a Canadian, and so on and so forth. And it's a very good mechanism, of course, if you want to avoid parochialism and inward looking, if you want to be sort of like digesting what's going on in other places. So in some ways one can compliment neoliberals for having such a capacity, which of course is rooted in, neoliberals had no problem with private funding, because in the time when the European states were under the rule of fascism and Nazis, and some of them were Jewish people, otherwise refugees, of course, some of the money that helped them to survive came from private business, from the Rockefeller Foundation, so the placement of many people in the United States, in the UK, in universities, of the original cohort, was of course accomplished with the help of the private entrepreneurs. So there was also a very positive emotional connection to what can be done by private initiative, also for your personal fate. And And many of them ended up Nachlup. Many of the Austrians, German neoliberal economists ended up in the United States and the UK and so on and so forth. And from there, of course, it was not far to see Hayek advised Anthony Fisher, the young entrepreneur who had made quite a lot of money in chicken farming, and he was the original investor in many of the think tanks that supported, basically, that were founded to support the sprawling market movement, the Institute of Economic Affairs in the UK, the Fraser Institute in Canada, and up down to Peru, over to Australia. Fisher had many corporate friends that were able to help with the funding. The intellectuals of the more personal society were professors at universities. They provided the academic legitimacy, and the think tank professionals were basically doing exactly what you just asked me to do: boil things down to simple lines for the general public. And
yes,
this was even described by Fisher, by Anthony Fisher, absolutely military terms. The intellectuals are the sort of like the far distance artillery. The people in the think tanks are the short distance sort of like artillery, and the politicians that are also the friends of these networks are sort of like the people that go into the hand fighting. And
who shall got shot in this image? These are very interesting imageries, and this is boiling to the point of the images. No?
Yes,
the images.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you beat
who should be defeated?
You need to,
who should be defeated by that? No?
You need to defeat. The university was considered to be basically in the hands of the socialists. No, in the post-war time, Marxism at university was considered the big enemy, and but not only Marxism. And basically, what Hayek and others of the neoliberals felt was having increasing weight in the major parties, this kind of spirit of planning and redistribution and so on, the modernization of the state. I mean, modernization theory and sort of like borrowing ideas from even Soviet and Chinese planning and instrumentalizing it to help non-communist economies to basically achieve better development rates and so on and so forth. And this was all considered the outcome of the same set of wrong ideas. No?
But it is warfare. Also, to fight against these ideas with artillery is warfare. Also, this imagery is very interesting. When we look at today's neoliberalism, on a global scale in terms of its practice, we have these common points. Now we have global markets, we have increasing social inequalities, we have ecological problems, and so on. What, seen from this background, what is the role, also the assumed role of the free individual as entrepreneur, as liberal entrepreneur, being active also for his small community, also this patriarchal approach of the benevolent entrepreneur? If we see all this, no? And if we compare it with today's crisis, what the neoliberal thinkers say about it, no? Recently.
If we can look at the two major crises that are, of course, interesting with regard to the global financial crisis, which was considered the death knell to neoliberalism. Many people, Stieglitz, many important people suggested this is the end of neoliberalism. And when you look at the capacity of neoliberals to organize, you see what they do. They organize a special meeting, and that one happened in New York, and discuss the crisis and discuss how you understand the crisis, agree with your enemy that something had to be done, namely to not end up like in the 1920s. And the then president, Deepak Lal, explained to everybody that both Keynes and neoliberals were rooted in Swedish neoclassical economics, and they agree. But the question was basically, how long should you invest? And then the neoliberals started immediately to reject notions that, basically the extraordinary need to secure capitalism in this heavy way was sort of like to be short. And then, you need to go back to normal. And so the summary perspective of what neoliberals suggested after the crisis of the global financial crisis was to defend the status quo of globalized neoliberal orders until crisis. So basically, you want not allow the crisis to be exploited for a system transformation, but you want to basically secure that it goes back to the way things were done until 2008. And of course, there's simply a concrete battle over how to regulate banks, no? And the progressive forces said you have to have more security. You have to ask the banks for higher own capital so that they can pay in case of crisis. And the banks don't want to have higher capital requirements because that lowers their profits. And so you have a concrete battle over the distribution of profits in this. And in the COVID crisis, it was very interesting. You could also think, oh, wow, the privatization of much of the welfare and healthcare system was, of course, undermining the public response. But the neoliberals were basically emphasizing how great the innovative capacities of firms was to develop a vaccine. No? So you can sell in response to the crisis.
It's the innovative entrepreneur, this Menschenbild of the innovative
entrepreneur. No matter that none of these vaccines would have existed without the massive preparation and support by state research bodies.
Of course, that's by the non-entrepreneurial side.
But I mean, it's very interesting to look exactly at the responses to understand that even such a crisis doesn't cause neoliberals necessarily a sleepless night. They look at the crisis always in ways of how to affirm their own way of reasoning and how to basically exploit the crisis in order to, in a way, make room for this type of reasoning. And that's basically, they need not to win every battle. They need not to shape every policy. But I mean, of course, if you have this feeling, okay, sorry, I was wrong, like the socialists after 1989, it was basically, oh, sorry, we were wrong. Then you give up, sort of like. So there was hardly any neo-socialist spirit after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And of course, we have a history of social democratic, socialist, communist ideas that is way richer than what it became, of course, in the ways it was organized in the Soviet Union. And even in the Soviet Union, many things were done that were actually very good. I mean, so it's basically it's very interesting to compare the ways to.
I worked in these countries in the 90s, the so-called transition period. And this brings me back to my initial point. What is the image of an let's say of a good society in the eyes of the recent neoliberal philosophy? Let's call it a philosophy. So a set of assumptions we discussed about, okay, and seen from this space, what is a good society?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this negative utopia, a good society is a society that doesn't restrict the initiative of the individuals in a sort of like an abstract way, and has sort of like. But I mean, you don't get very far in this description because it's in a way too abstract, no? Because, for example, if you consider the relevance of social equality for initiative, I mean, basically, before we had the modern support for people from working classes to go to higher education, there was simply no way for poor people to go to school. I mean, they didn't have the money. And so anybody who claims that we need nothing but openness is denying the relevance where you're born. The lottery of the postal code is the lottery of the country that you're born. So an ambitious program of supporting the openness of society for the individual initiative requires a huge amount of redistribution that they never talk about.
Exactly.
It's
exactly these are the contradictions, these inherent contradictions in the assumptions themselves.
The replacement of the agenda of equal opportunity for everybody, by the openness for initiative for those people who already have.
Yeah. And therefore, I was concentrating on these basic assumptions, because these assumptions generate realities.
Sure. But I mean, this is exactly where you need to ask always not just about the abstract principle of freedom and the abstract
Yeah.
for personal development, who would not be in support of that, but you need to ask what kind of conditions are actually required to meet this goal. No? So inheritance taxes. I mean, if it's really about individual accomplishment, then okay, everybody who has become rich should give away the money so that the children can also prove that they have the initiative. No, and otherwise, of course, it's simply the security for the treaty for this property rights. If they are secured as they are, means basically a continuation of very unequal property distribution for as long as possible. And
and this is no solution to the existing problems we actually have.
No, we will always have them as a result, of course, the social conflict that we see in the countries. And of course, this is and of course, the hidden dimension of the neoliberal program is also that you want the community to be strong to defend the property relations. So, of course, the unspoken agenda is always, of course, also the protection of the hierarchy resulting out of the current.
This is not very innovative.
So where what you never see is that the privatization, and I mean only in some very radical versions of Mises, where the privatization of security is also on the agenda. But in most versions of neoliberalism, if you talk about privatization, and or the shrinking of the state, you will hardly hear them talking about the shrinking of the military. You will hardly hear them shrinking the police, and that's usually quite the moment where you kind of need to address. And then
which are seen from this background in your eyes, which are the major threats coming out of this neoliberal agenda when put in practice? The assumption is well, it is a worldwide, it's a globally operating system in practical terms. This is an assumption. But if it is the case, which are the major threats, the major dangers inherent to this philosophy of neoliberalism as it is now?
Well, as a global system, I wouldn't even give too much credit to neoliberals. I mean, the organized neoliberals are not the global superpower. They are one force in all kinds of political and philosophical and other struggles, social struggles that obviously have to compete with other forces. I mean, they're not alone in the world, and otherwise they would probably not need to be so organized, no? And so and you can see the dimension of the struggles pretty well if you look at present-day Argentina, for example, where one of their heroes, Milei, has been winning the elections on the basis of the support from civil society structures rooted in think tanks and other organizations. And he is basically quite a serious force trying to turn into practice many of these ideas by reducing, getting rid of many ministries, and he tries to eliminate trade union rights and so on and so forth. And of course, you have a lot of struggle in the street. I guess it's very easy to see that I haven't seen a comprehensive program of neoliberals to respond to the social crisis of the day and to the ecological crisis. And these are, of course, the two major dimensions. And unless ideologies are able to address those major dimensions, they will have a hard time. I mean, they will basically convince only their own clienteles and not be able to become hegemonic. So what we see now is a much stronger gain of other varieties of thinking, national conservatism, which is again sort of like trying to mobilize social association much more on a kind of a national scale, frequently in opposition to enemies, opponents on the other side. So basically we see there's a new national conservatism manifesto that basically, like in the Cold War time, looks at China and Russia as the big enemy, and everything in society should be organized to meet these challenges. It's very interesting how basically neoliberals in the old days tried to move politics very much away from the national level to the international level, European Union, central banks, WTO, and so on, to remove politics from the grip of trade unions and their representatives in parliament. Now we see actually, as they recognize the threat is much more coming from the global climate crisis and the global redistribution efforts and regulation efforts coming to deal with global warming. We see this new inclination to actually renationalize Brexit, devolve, basically countries out of international governance, so that allegedly they have more suffering again. But what does it mean? It means that you refuse to cooperate internationally to solve problems. And on the other hand, you mobilize. We see this with NATO. We see this in the kind of military, new military scenarios. It's actually building capacity to achieve new goals. Now, remilitarize, build up capacities. But I mean, of course, it's very easy to see that this is also in the face of the climate crisis, maybe the road to catastrophe and not the road to secure the future. So we can only hope that many of these investments in military get redirected again in what we actually need. But I mean, yeah, that's exactly where you see, I mean, and many of these national conservatism perspectives are overlapping with neoliberal perspectives, also in sort of like they're not necessarily objecting to the market order, the property rights, and so on. Sometimes in the field of the rule of the law, we see conflicts because we see that in Poland, in Hungary, in the US, court packing, we see the attempt of the government to take over the judiciary. There, the neoliberal suddenly comes in as the critique. Because neoliberal criticism of the politicians of the state is exactly one of their own self-perceived strengths. No, the politician is egoistic, only serves her own interests, and the kind of attempt to control the judiciary, of course, opens the door for any type of corruption, and so you can suddenly see the evil neoliberal as the person who attacks exactly the even more evil corruption
of the other side. Let me pose a question. Let's change the perspective. No? In your opinion, are there any positive elements, let's call it ideology, in the ideology, in literal terms, as the logos of ideas, the system of ideas, in the ideology of neoliberal thinking as it is today? Are there any positive points, positive in the sense, well, these aspects could really lead to progress in society, could really lead to solve the existing ecological and economic and socio-economic problems we have, as it means could really lead to minimizing or closing the social inequalities existing now due to property, and could really help to master the ecological problems, climate crisis included. This is an ecological problem.
Oh, the answer is a simple no.
Okay.
As a system of thought and ideas, there are elements in neoliberal thinking that are not hostile to such approaches. For example, if you think of the idea that you need a universal order, so that would mitigate against this neo-nationalism that is basically built up to undermine global cooperation. So any approach in the neoliberal framework of thinking that thinks in truly global terms is not inimical to approaches to deal with the climate crisis, because we have planetary boundaries and not sort of like regional problems to deal with. So in that sense, the wing of neoliberalism that has been trying to conceptualize ideas that require basically a universal order to which all people subscribe is, I would say, actually indeed a precondition for a possible sort of
Mm-hmm.
approach to possibly a successful approach to the crisis. Yet at the same time, of course, this is basically not enough. No, I mean, a global system to protect the uneven property relations, which is the essential of neoliberalism. For neoliberalism, inequality is good, is productive, is inherently something that needs to be defended, is exactly the opposite of what we need. I mean, we would need neoliberals to embrace a much greater dimension of redistribution than they have been willing to do so far, both between nations and between classes, in order to come to terms. And I don't see this. I mean, we have, of course, elements of neoliberal debates. I mean, some of them are really appalled by the neo-nationalist and social conservative right-wing developments. So we see more struggles within these. People leave like organizations they don't like anymore, the Hayek Gesellschaft, for example, in Germany and others. But we haven't, I mean, we have yet to see if of some of the new circles of deliberation. There's this new German language network of Ordnungsökonomie and Sozialphilosophie, which is basically driven by more centrist neoliberals. They want to approach questions in a sort of like, they have done a new colloque Walter Lippmann. I mean, that's interesting because, of course, that's a historical signal. The colloque Walter Lippmann was done because of the perceived graveness of the crisis of the 1930s. And if I do a new Walter Lippmann, I say I'm in a similar situation as I was.
Yeah, this is a sign. This is a message. Yeah.
And so, but we have to see, and this is interesting also in terms of the. This is a group that has opened up to actually, unlike Hayek. I mean, this is a group that Hayek had actually opposed Popper and others who had suggested the society should be more pluralist. And Hayek said, no, we need to basically be pretty much on the same page. So limited pluralism in Hayek's concept. Whereas what I see in terms of the membership of this new network, NOUS, Network of Order, Economics and Social Philosophy, is that they actually opened up to a number of people. I'm not sure if I would call them neoliberals. I mean, they're basically, so it's that could be an interesting development. Because that, of course, suggests I'm not so sure anymore if my construction of ideology, my building blocks, my morphology is sufficient. If I need sort of like to accept that private property rights cannot be an unchallenged case.
And it's about the morphology of ideas. So this I was after. Also, this is one general method or point of view of our foundation's work. So if we use the figure, it's more than just a metaphor of the morphology. Also, ideas have a morphology, and to adapt the morphology as a part of an evolutionary process, it's a very interesting thing to observe. How you would, please.
I think that since you just mentioned Walter Lippmann, okay, I think Walter Lippmann is also, I think, is rather well known as someone who's like stressed the importance of public relations, okay, and that basically if you can sell an idea and if people believe the idea, then people believe that it's true, okay, and part of like the
mass
the
communication.
neoliberal ideology is to sell a better society. The idea of a better society comes from maximizing the individual entrepreneurial initiatives of people within society. Okay. So, well, I just that's just my PS. Okay, it's not really a question, but I think
the elitism. This is another. I mean, many technocratic-minded people. I mean, it's kind of funny because neoliberalism basically confesses to critique technocracy, and then you see what they do is basically their own neoliberal technocracy. So basically, the modern society in a way was modeled after the Fabian society, and the Fabian society, of course, was in the UK, the socialist elite club that basically also had the idea that we as thinkers, we can basically plan what is good for society. And so if I arranged the modern society in the same spirit, then of course means that with all claims to we are not really interested in planning the future, they were actually in a way leaning on the Fabian ideas of how to plan the future, namely by arranging these kind of intellectual networks to shape ideas and to win the public. And I mean, if you look at the composition of their members, then you also see the role of the Walter Lippmann types. Walter Lippmann himself actually was invited to join the Modern Society, but declined, and he became actually part of the competing project of the Ford Foundation and the modernization theory, which became one of the things that people from the Modern Society strongly opposed to, because it was much more leaning on also state-directed planning and so on and so forth. So Lippmann, but I mean many other journalists joined, and you had always a group of high-end journalists from important newspapers in their ranks.
Okay, Dieter, would you like to make any closing remarks and bring some points that you think people should be aware of that we haven't touched on?
I would invite people who think of neoliberalism and are serious about engaging neoliberalism to absolutely don't hesitate to look at this, what these networks of organized neoliberalism continue to do to this day. So look at the Atlas network, which is basically the think tank network that Anthony Fisher started organizing in the 1980s to coordinate his individual private efforts and bring it under an organized umbrella. And this organization is nowadays operating with about 500 think tanks worldwide, and you can look up the think tanks that operate in your country, in your region, and basically see what. So basically, we should talk more about what neoliberals say rather than what we think neoliberals say, and that would enrich the debate tremendously, because then we can also better judge what of it is possibly interesting and what of it is, maybe good that it doesn't, if it doesn't play a big role.
Okay, many thanks. Many thanks for
You're very welcome. I'm looking forward to the resulting event. Huh?
Yeah, the resulting event.
Thank you so much, Dieter. We really appreciate this, and we will send you a copy of the transcript for this conversation. And if you think something is missing or misinterpreted, just please let us know.
So this you are using for your podcast series, or what? How do you?
We are using it for the podcast series, and we will use parts of this podcast in our symposium. So in case you cannot be present, also not online, which would be much better, clear. But then we said, okay, realistically, we need to illuminate the historical background, the evolution of the whole idea, as you outlined it today. So this we will also use. And in addition, I want to mention we have a journal associated with our foundation. The journal is called Urban Eidos, no? Like the Greek Eidos. No? And we plan to make a journal issue after the symposium about these aspects of the so-called neoliberal agenda, to illuminate it from different perspectives. And you could consider, I would appreciate it if you would look at our Urban Eidos journal. It's on our website, on the Ideal Spaces website. You find it under journal, or you can Google directly. It's very easy to find as a journal, Urban Eidos. And as said, for our third issue forthcoming after the symposium, we would be happy to, if you could participate with an article. No? The base, very short, it is DOI based. No? The journal, it is online open access and DOI based, and we are positively surprised that we started with our first issue this year, that we had 2,000 downloads per article in the first issue. This is something, without machine downloads, means real downloads by human beings.
All right, we'll look at it. Huh?
Have a look at it. I would appreciate to go in these issues you addressed today a bit more deeper in an article also.
Well, I will certainly also be interested in how you proceed with all these projects. Or is this then basically is the neoliberalism theme then basically?
No, it's not over. No, it's not over, because as regards the core business of our foundation is about community and space, and about the history of ideas, and of course which are the driving forces in the direction of making an ideal community, whatever it is in the different conception. It's not just about communities in the sense of today, let's make small decentralized communities by, as you had it today, by liberated individuals. This is and this is our business, the relations between built space communities and, first of all, future concepts based on a history of ideas of former concepts. No? And if we understand architecture also as architecture of organization, and not only of visible buildings, and then we have it as regards the neoliberal agenda and its importance. No? And here we want to continue anyway, because the theme is too important, because reality shaping.
Yeah, of course. I mean, basically, I look at this. It's interesting that, of course, because of climate change, there's also this increasingly urgent need of adaptation, where, of course, the city, the urban space is super relevant to save people's lives. And but I guess that's exactly the point. I mean, neoliberals would be happy to have people collaborate, to experiment. And we need to, in a way, secure that there's enough money for every city to build enough water space and shadow space and rearrange cities, so that not some cities can do it that are fortunate enough to have the money, and other cities are remaining heat shocked.
Yeah, it's about redistribution of wealth, as you had it in this direction. To give you a feeling as of what we are doing, we had a very good symposium last year called The Natural City. It's on our website. And here we also treat assumptions, leaving this mainstream discourse about the ecologically correct city, to concentrate only on that. We have technologically perfected eco-cities. No, to the nature of the human being does not only belong the biological nature, but also culture. If we go back to these old Occidental ideas and dichotomies, we have nature, culture, and however they relate. And culture is an important issue. For instance, in cities, cultural heritage. And this is again important in the neoliberal agenda. In an investor-driven city by private property, what the fuck is about the cultural heritage, if it is true that cultural heritage is counting for identity, means in the end for society, for social peace, for community. What's about a communal place, no, in cities? No? When you visit cities like London, for instance, some newly built districts in the docks or so, no? Where is a real communal place? And
Well,
and
they
this,
destroy them in Berlin. They try now to get rid of the public space to grill, which
yeah.
the
This
rich
is,
people have their gardens and the poor people are supposed
and
to.
that's it. And that's it. No? And these are very important points I want to address as also in the symposium to come. And this was the background as why I insisted on this mention build things as in practical terms and not in philosophical terms.
Well, good luck, and looking forward to read more of it and
Okay,
maybe
alles klar.
participate in some of it if I can. But
Yeah,
I'm in Czech Republic at the time, or coming back from Czech Republic.
okay,
That's why
okay.
there was no way to make it to Karlsruhe. But maybe there's a future conversation.
We would be happy. We would be happy. Ellen and I also, I think. This is it will be a theme, the neoliberal agenda, no? In the future also, no, for us. No? Okay, okay. Many
Bye-bye.
thanks. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ciao. I will switch to Skype very shortly, or?
Yes.